What is the state of America's health?
Well, I think it's not good. I think everybody knows that Americans are among the fattest and sickest people on the planet. And even though America spends more on healthcare as a percent of their total economy than any nation on the planet, and their track record on this whole COVID-19 pandemic has also been pretty dismal. And when we think about almost 500,000 deaths, number one in the world on that count. And, I think the big problem really in both the United States and Canada, for that matter, is that we actually have disease care systems as opposed to healthcare systems. And it's wonderful for fixing bones or people that have been in car accidents, but it's not great for what kills the vast majority of our populations. And of course, that is chronic diseases that are lifestyle induced. And we know our Western dietary pattern, we call it the SAD diet or the standard American diet, and our sedentary lifestyles are to blame. So how do we change that? I think we might start by beginning to subsidize foods that support health rather than undermine it. Perhaps we might consider removing industry influence from our national nutrition policies. We've done a pretty good job of that in Canada, not so much so in the United States. And perhaps we might make lifestyle medicine the first line of therapy for treating people that have lifestyle-induced chronic diseases. We might start actually offering it as a treatment option for people. And so I think there are some solutions, but we've got a long way to go. And at this point, it's just not good.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, the author of The Case for Keto? The big difference between the physicians and researchers who admitted to using keto 20 years ago for temporary weight loss and those eating and prescribing keto today is that the latter now believe these diets are the healthiest way for them and their patients to eat. They don't worry about the saturated fat their patients will be eating because the clinical trials confirm this way of eating is beneficial, and they can see their patients and themselves getting healthier, often over the course of weeks or a few months. They are loath to recommend anything else. I've interviewed more than 120 of these physicians who tell me that they chose medicine as a career because they wanted to make their patients healthy, not to manage chronic disease. Getting their patients off carb-rich foods, at the very least, sugars, grains, and starches, and eating something akin to keto makes that happen. When public health authorities argue that a healthy diet for all means mostly plants, they make the job of these physicians and the challenge to their patients that much harder. So again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
Oh, it just makes me mad. I honestly think that Gary Taubes is just wrong about pretty much everything when it comes to health. And it's no coincidence that pretty much every national and international health authority on the planet disagrees with him. When they're making evidence-based recommendations, they're all recommending predominantly plant-based diets. And it's true that if we take sugar-sweetened beverages and sugar-laden white flour products off the menu, it's a good thing. And yes, those are carbohydrates. But taking away vegetables and fruits and legumes and whole grains and nuts and seeds is not a good thing. These are the foods, these are the carbohydrate-rich foods that are very, very strongly tied to longevity and disease risk reduction. And what is he replacing these foods with? Mainly animal-derived fat and protein. And animal-derived fat and protein is consistently linked to the risk of death and disease. We've got so much evidence for this. In the biggest meta-analysis to date, low carbohydrate diets were associated with a 32% increased risk of mortality. And they went on, when carbohydrate was replaced with animal-derived fat or protein, the risk of death increased 18%. And when carbohydrates were replaced with plant-derived fat or protein, the risk was reduced by 18%. Keto diets are so notoriously unhealthy that they rated dead last out of 39 diets for healthy eating in the 2021 US News Diet Rankings. Why? Because they're so unhealthy.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? Keto diets are based on the proposition that for those predisposed to become obese and or diabetic, carbohydrate-rich foods trigger that predisposition. That isn't because of the calories they contain, as the conventional thinking on keto diets are based on that the obesity assumes, but because of the effect these foods have on insulin, the hormone that dominates the regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism. Insulin is secreted mostly in response to carbohydrates, not just in the form of sugars, starches, and grains, whole or otherwise, but also fruits and legumes, which are the staples of a well-formulated plant-based diet. A high insulin level signals fat synthesis and storage, and a low level its release as free fatty acid back into the circulation, observed the Harvard University metabolism and diabetes researcher George F. Cahill Jr. in 1971 in the prestigious Banting Memorial Lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association. This process is like a switch. When fat cells sense the presence of insulin in the circulation, as Cahill described it, they respond by storing fat and inhibiting its release, and we get fatter. When insulin is undetectable, we burn stored fat or fuel, and we get leaner. The metabolic state of ketosis, from which the keto diet gets its name, happens when carbohydrates are restricted almost entirely and fat provides most of the fuel for the body. The hormonal insulin-centric regulation of fat storage and fat metabolism remains textbook medicine. Yet its relevance to obesity has been effectively ignored by nutritionists and obesity researchers who have overwhelmingly preferred to think that all calories are equally capable of stimulating fat accumulation, that we get fat because we overeat, not because the carbohydrates we consume have some unique ability to stimulate fat accumulation. For some significant proportion of Americans, however, remaining relatively lean and healthy may require minimizing their insulin secretion. This, in turn, means more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrate-rich foods. Animal-sourced foods, meat, fish, fowl, and even processed meat, typically make up the bulk of this approach to weight control because they are almost entirely protein and fat with minimal carbohydrates. Until insulin was discovered in 1921 and insulin therapy was put to use in treating diabetes, these diets were known as animal diets. They were the standard of care for diabetes, delaying death in what today is called type 1 diabetes, the insulin-dependent form, and controlling the disease indefinitely in those with type 2, the common form associated with excess weight and age. This is still the case. Again, Brenda, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
It covers an awful lot of material, but essentially, if what he said were actually true, you would think probably be reflected in diabetes rates around the world. And in fact, some of the lowest rates of diabetes that we see are in populations that are actually at the higher end of the carbohydrate spectrum. Just think about the people in the blue zones. They average about 62% of their calories as carbohydrates. The people in Bolivia, the Semeni, I think they're called Semeni people, they average 72% of calories from carbohydrates, and they have among the lowest rates of heart disease and diabetes on the planet. And we have so many studies that have very clearly demonstrated that excess fat leads to greater fat accumulation than excess carbohydrates. And actually, I'm not just saying that this theory was actually put to the test in the most rigorous form of trial that we have. It's called a metabolic ward trial. And there was a study done in 2020 that involved 20 overweight men and women, and they were kept in a metabolic ward where they had no access to any food other than what was provided to them. And the study was a crossover design. So this means that you're put on a certain diet for a set period of time, and then you cross over to another diet. And this diet, or this study, was really interesting because it compared a keto diet, which was 75% of calories from fat and 10% of calories from carbohydrate. So it was a fairly moderate keto diet, to a low-fat vegan diet that was 75% of calories from carbohydrate and 10% of calories from fat. So the exact opposite. And what it was, they basically have complete control over what their participants are doing. And while the keto diet did lower blood glucose and insulin and triglycerides compared to the vegan diet, it actually impaired glucose tolerance, and it increased loss of muscle. And glucose tolerance, this is all about insulin resistance. And so what they found is it actually made insulin resistance worse, which is not what you're trying to accomplish. And the other thing that was really interesting is the vegan diet resulted in over 3 times more fat loss than the keto diet. So it was triple the fat loss. What the keto people were losing was more muscle tissue, whereas the vegans were losing more fat. And so he can say what he wants, but the evidence is really clear. By eating animal sourced foods like meat, fish, fowl, processed meat, you are essentially doing one thing. You are cutting out the components that we know in the diet are most protective against diabetes. Things like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and sterols and stanols and unsaturated fats, and a lot of the micronutrients that are concentrated in plants, like folate, for example. You are essentially maximizing the pro-inflammatory compounds such as saturated fat and oxidized cholesterol and nitrates and TMAO and endotoxins and new 5-GC and all the products of oxidation you get when you cook meat, like heterocyclic amines, environmental contaminants. All of those things are heightened when you're eating a diet that's predominantly animal products. And that, there are benefits associated with low carbohydrate diets in terms of reducing insulin secretion, for example, but they are very short term. These diets are associated with weight loss, but no more than what plant-based diets are associated with. They do tend to do a few things that are positive, but there are so many known disadvantages that it's not worth the risk, in my view, especially when carbohydrate intakes are below 50 grams a day, which they are in keto diets. And just to give you an example, the impacts, they increase LDL cholesterol, they reduce kidney function, or they damage kidney function, they increase risk of kidney stones, and they mess up gut microflora. They are bad for bone health. They're bad for nutritional status. They cause inflammation. They impair athletic performance. They just do a whole whack of horrible things. And people that are on these diets, generally what you see is they complain of constipation and headaches and bad breath and muscle weakness. And in the long term, low carbohydrate diets increase mortality. They increase our exposure to persistent organic pollutants. They reduce bone density. They impair artery function. They increase risk of cardiovascular disease. They have even been associated with birth defects and possibly colon cancer because they're so high in meat. It just makes no sense to me that if somebody actually looks at the literature, that they would come up with the kinds of pronouncements that Gary Taubes makes.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? No meaningful experimental evidence, no clinical trials exist to support the contention that we would live longer, healthier lives by eating mostly plants rather than animal-sourced foods.
Well, it's just a lie. I mean, it's just an absolute lie. If there's no way that any individual who goes to PubMed and does a search of all of the scientific literature we have could say this. I know there's a mountain of meaningful experimental evidence that supports the contention that we would live longer, healthier lives eating mostly plants. And it's true, a lot of the evidence does come from observational studies, but there are more and more clinical trials that have confirmed the findings of observational studies. That's what they're meant to do. And we have to accept clinical trials are expensive. They're not easy to do long-term. They're usually short-term. And but we still have a number of meaningful trials. And most of them, I think, are longer in duration than the keto trials. The evidence is, and again, I said this before, but I'll say it again, the evidence is so strong that the major health authorities from, whatever you look at, the World Health Organization, our national and international organizations for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, they all recommend a predominantly plant-based diet for a reason. It's because the evidence supports a plant-based diet as being the most protective against these diseases, and in fact, the most effective at treating these diseases as well.
What are your thoughts on this passage from Gary Taubes, author of The Case for Keto? When I started reporting on this subject as a journalist 20 years ago, virtually no meaningful research had been published to test the claims of the diet book doctors, most famously Robert Atkins, who advocated this way of eating. When I started reporting, since then, carbohydrate-restricted diets, keto or otherwise, may have become the most tested diets in history. The website clinicaltrials.gov reports more than 100 clinical trials of ketogenic diets in progress and nearly 90 completed. The findings are consistent. Ketogenic eating is safe and effective at controlling both weight and blood sugar. Pick a disease from Alzheimer's and anxiety disorders to traumatic brain injury and tumors, and researchers somewhere are probably testing whether eating a ketogenic diet improves its prognosis. In 2019, the American Diabetes Association concluded that low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate diets, that is, keto, were the only dietary therapies that consistently resulted in beneficial outcomes for adults with diabetes or prediabetes. In 2017, more than 100 Canadian physicians co-signed a letter to the Huffington Post declaring that they personally follow keto-like regimens and now counsel their patients to do so too. What we see in our clinics, these physicians wrote, is that blood sugar values go down, blood pressure drops, chronic pain decreases or disappears, lipid profiles improve, inflammatory markers improve, energy increases, weight decreases, sleep is improved, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome symptoms are lessened, etc. Medication is adjusted downward or even eliminated, which reduces the side effects for patients and the costs to society. The results we achieve with our patients are impressive and durable. Again, what are your thoughts on that passage from Gary Taubes?
I mean, I just can't believe the extent of the claims he makes. I mean, we see very similar claims, of course, in the plant-based community and all of the physicians who are lifestyle medicine physicians and are promoting, healthy plant-based diets for their patients. To me, the difference is the people promoting plant-based diets will actually have patients still alive 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, whereas the people promoting keto diets will start losing their patients. I just, when I think about some of the claims, ADA, the American Diabetes Association, did put out a consensus report on nutrition therapy for adults with diabetes or prediabetes in 2019. And the purpose of the report was really to provide evidence-based guidelines about nutrition therapy. And yes, they do suggest that low carbohydrate diets are effective for meeting glycemic targets. They do not suggest that they're the only diet therapies that are beneficial. And in fact, if you read the document, Gary Taubes claims that they say they're the only diets. They very clearly state that a variety of eating patterns can work and are acceptable for the management of diabetes. And they emphasize, they say three things. They say these patterns should emphasize non-starchy vegetables. They should minimize added sugars and refined grains. and people should be choosing whole foods over highly processed foods. They suggest a Mediterranean style diet, which is a plant predominant diet, or low fat diets, which they describe as vegetarian or vegan or plant-based, or a low carb diet. So they recommend really 3 types of diets. They also urge that people with diabetes get at least 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. Good luck doing that on a keto diet. They suggest intact grains, non-starchy vegetables, avocados, fruits, berries, beans, peas, and lentils as the best sources of these of this fiber. Most of these are excluded on keto diets. So you're not going to get fiber from meat or fat. So it's just I don't know. And it's also interesting to note, he mentioned these 100 physicians from Canada. Well, Diabetes Canada clinical practice guidelines states that, the style of eating that works best for diabetes may be described as, and this is directly from their official clinical practice guidelines, a Mediterranean style diet, a vegan or vegetarian diet, a DASH diet, a Nordic style diet, which is largely plant-based, and dietary patterns that emphasize legumes, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. That's what they say. So he has definitely a way of cherry picking things that he wants to hear. I just be very skeptical, be very, very skeptical of whatever Gary Taubes says.
Your new book, Nourish, the definitive plant-based nutrition guide for families, with pediatrician Reshma Shah, discusses nutrition for families with an emphasis on pregnancy, lactation, and nutrition for children. Are vegan diets really safe and adequate for small children?
Well, they are, and I'll just show you the book. This is the new book. Let's see, can you see it? It's just a gorgeous cover. It just came out in November of 2020, and Reshma Shah is actually a pediatrician. And so it was really fun to work with a pediatrician on this project. And she is just so balanced in her thinking. It was a joy to partner with her. And so getting to the question, are vegan diets really safe and adequate for children? It really all depends on how well they're designed, like any diet. But in the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position statement on vegetarian diets, they very unequivocally state that well-planned plant-based diets are safe and nutritionally adequate during all stages of the life cycle, including during infancy and childhood. But as I mentioned, a plant-based diet, like any diet, needs to be well-planned in order to maximize nutritional benefit and minimize risk of deficiencies. And plant-based diets do tend to be high in fiber. And while that's almost always a good thing, for small children who have little tiny stomachs, the diet can get bulky. So it makes sense to sort of moderate fiber intake for children by adding lower fiber foods like peanut butter and tofu, and even maybe some pasta in there. And generally, we need to think about how to meet needs for nutrients that may be questionable. And we can talk more specifically about those, but generally we may need to include some supplements as well. But studies have shown that children eating plant-based diets that are sufficient in calories and variety and have the appropriate supplementation, those vegan children grow just as well as children eating omnivorous diets. And and the other thing that I think to consider is not only can children eating plant-based diets have adequate growth and development, but actually there have been studies showing that the overall quality of the diet is actually superior. Children eating plant-based diets tend to have higher intakes of fruits and vegetables. They tend to have healthier body weights. They actually eat more of things like legumes, nuts, and seeds. They eat fewer sugars and sugar sweetened beverages. They eat less saturated fat. So there are a lot of potential benefits with a plant-based diet for children. And of course, long term, we're instilling these healthy eating patterns that will support a healthy diet as they become adults and reduce the risk of all of these chronic diseases like hypertension and high cholesterol and diabetes and all of those sort of lifestyle-induced diseases. So there's no reason to think that a vegan diet can't adequately nourish a child.
What are the nutrients most commonly lacking in diets of toddlers? How can we be sure plant-based toddlers do not fall short?
Yeah, so the key nutrients of concern for toddlers are usually vitamin D and iron. And for all toddlers, regardless of dietary pattern. So that's why we recommend vitamin D drops from pretty much from birth and until at least 12 months of age. But for many parents, it would be continued throughout childhood. And iron, a child's iron stores actually start to run out somewhere between 4 and 6 months of age. So the American Academy of Pediatrics actually suggests that at 4 months, we begin providing iron at a rate of about 1 milligram per kilogram body weight until they're consuming enough iron from solid foods. And that's not just for plant-based children, it's for all children. And it's really important to know that preemies or premature babies don't have those iron stores, so they need to be supplemented with iron from birth. Now, parents of plant-based toddlers also want to ensure reliable sources of vitamin B12 and iodine. Those are two nutrients that may not be found in sufficient amounts in plant-based diets. So vitamin B12 is super, super important. And what we want to do, for B12 is to provide fortified foods and probably a supplement of about 250 micrograms, maybe twice a week for a preschool child, and you can get drops for that. Iodine is another one that can be an issue, especially for parents that don't use iodized salt or seaweed. And so toddlers need about 90 micrograms of iodine a day. So that, you can do a few things to achieve that. So you can do, a quarter teaspoon of iodized salt, or you can do a little bit of seaweed and, like a quarter teaspoon of dulse granules or a few sheets of nori. Usually nori has about 20 to 40 micrograms per sheet. So you could do maybe 2 sheets of nori or something like that. But it's also an option if you're doing a multivite is to pick one with iodine as well. And then the other nutrients that do come up, which I think deserve some consideration, are calcium, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids. And a lot of people think protein is a concern. So I'll talk about each of those briefly, but protein is less of a concern than many people believe it to be. And in fact, the most recent study we have was done on 430 toddlers, and these were aged 1 to 3 years. This was in Germany. There were 139 vegans, and then the rest were consuming other dietary patterns. All the dietary groups had well in excess of the RDA for protein. So the RDA for protein at this age, for this age category, is about 1.05 grams per kilogram body weight. Well, the omnivores averaged 2.7 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. The vegetarians 2.3, that's the lacto-ovo vegetarians, and the vegans were 2.4. So they were all over double what they needed to be. So there were no issues getting enough protein for these toddlers. And in this study, they didn't observe any differences in growth or energy intakes, regardless of dietary pattern. All their micronutrient intakes were adequate. And you also have to remember that most Western diets, just think about this when you think, oh, well, vegan, you have to supplement with B12, so that makes it not good. Well, if you think about Western diets, we have for many, many decades fortified foods as we've needed to. So for example, we add vitamin D to milk, we add iron to infant cereal, we add iodine to salt, we add B vitamins to flour products and rice, to safeguard against nutritional deficiencies for the population. And as we shift towards a more plant-based diet, food fortification will adapt to, a more plant-based dietary pattern, and we'll start adding B12 and perhaps zinc and long-chain omega-3 fatty acids to foods, as need be. But to ensure that toddlers don't fall short, there are some really simple things you can do. You can follow in Nourish. We have a nice food guide with amounts of foods and so forth that would be recommended. But you want the diet to include a good variety of plant foods. So including legumes and whole grains and vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds. You do not want to do a low-fat diet for young children. They need about 30 to 40% of calories from fat at that age. So we need to provide adequate fat sources. And so we're looking at things like, nut and seed butters and avocados, and you can even use some oils as well. You want to choose fortified non-dairy milk. So because, particularly for calcium and vitamin D, you get that little boost from these foods. So 1 cup of fortified non-dairy milk can have 300 to 450 milligrams of calcium, which makes it very easy to meet the 700 milligrams that are recommended in this age category. So, and you also want to, choose the more nutrient dense milks like soy milk or pea milk, as opposed to something that is very low nutritionally like almond milk. Even though it's got the calcium and vitamin D, it doesn't have a lot of protein or other trace nutrients. And I would continue offering the additional vitamin D as drops or a liquid multi. And then we talked about the amount of B12, couple, 250 micrograms twice a week, or 10 micrograms a day you could do as well. One thing that you can do to ensure iron adequacy for toddlers is to continue to use infant cereal, and you can use it, in pancakes, and you can use it in muffins, and you can use it sprinkled on oatmeal or stirred in oatmeal to give a little extra boost of iron as well. And then you want to choose foods as a part of the regular diet that are rich in zinc. Things like legumes and pumpkin seeds and cashews and things like that are helpful. The other thing that's a little more controversial is whether or not EPA, DHA are beneficial. And I would suggest that it makes sense to add them, and 70 milligrams a day would be a reasonable amount at this age. I don't see any potential adverse effects of doing so, and there are potential benefits in terms of cognitive function long-term with ensuring a source. So I would do that.
There's a lot of press about choline and the importance of consuming eggs to get enough of this nutrient. Can vegans get sufficient choline?
Well, it's true that choline, I think choline was deemed an essential nutrient in 1998. So this is we've only known about choline and its importance for a relatively short time. And vegans do consume less than omnivores because although choline is pretty much distributed throughout the food supply, animal foods are the most concentrated sources, like, eggs particularly, but things like meat and fish and liver and poultry are all concentrated as well. And choline is important for brain function. It's important for fat metabolism. It's important for the functioning of our cell membranes because it is needed to form the primary phospholipid in cell membranes. And it's it's used to make neurotransmitters, and so it's really important nutrient. And we actually don't have an RDA for choline, which is a recommended dietary allowance. We just have an AI, which is like a best guess. It's called an acceptable intake because we actually don't have enough information to establish an RDA. So the AI is 550 milligrams for men and 425 for women, although that does increase during pregnancy and lactation. It's 450 during pregnancy and 550 during lactation. But very few people actually meet the AI for choline. I would guess 90% of people don't meet it, and that those numbers, I'm not sure exactly where they came from, but there was one study that was done showing that we could get deficiency with less than 50 milligrams, and a lot of experts think probably 300 milligrams would be enough for most people, which is much easier to achieve than 400 or 500 milligrams. So we we probably, if we're pregnant, would be wise to take a supplement with choline, just to be on the safe side, because birth defects have been associated with low choline intake. But otherwise, I think just having a varied diet, including some really good sources of choline, like soy products. Just a cup of soy milk is about 57 milligrams. And that's even higher than dairy milk. Quinoa, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, there are quite a few foods that are, decent sources. And so, you could effectively get 150 milligrams from one meal if it contained things like quinoa and broccoli and tofu. So you could come pretty close to that AI, but if you're around the 300, I actually wouldn't worry about it too much, other than if you're pregnant, I would really try to aim for the AI.
Do you recommend vitamin D supplements for adults?
Absolutely. I recommend them for both adults and children. There are some people who can make enough vitamin D by getting sufficient exposure to warm sunshine year round, and maintain good vitamin D status. But they're far and few in between. The vast majority of people in the world don't get enough vitamin D from sunshine, and so they need to get some from food. If you live where I do in Calgary, this morning it was minus 40 in Calgary. We're not making any vitamin D between about October and probably March or April. So we need to have a source, and food can be a source. But there aren't a lot of food sources. You think fish and eggs, not a lot of, there's a little bit of vitamin D in mushrooms that are grown in sunshine, but there are not a lot of vitamin D sources in foods, unless the foods are fortified with vitamin D, as cow's milk is, as non-dairy milks are. So you can get some from that. But for most adults, I think it makes absolute sense to aim for 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day. However, it's kind of good to know where you're at. So to have a vitamin D test to see where your levels are at, and I've had a number of friends who have done that and found that their levels were just so low, they were absolutely shocked. And Michael Hollick, who's probably the leading expert on vitamin D, actually suggests 2,000 to 3,000 IUs a day for adults, and at least 2,000 for women and 1,000 for children. So that's, that's something to consider. I think to guarantee sufficiency, you probably should be doing it on a daily basis. And for people who are severely overweight or obese, they may actually require more. So they should kind of monitor their status. I think we know enough at this point that we can say with some confidence that vitamin D supplements are a very reasonable thing to do.
Should pregnant women take DHA? Are supplemental DHA and EPA recommended for others?
My opinion is yes. And the reason I say that is simply because vegans, the level of EPA and DHA in their blood and tissue tends to be about a third, to a half of what it is for omnivores. And we do know that higher levels are associated with retinal function and brain development and so forth, that we need this stuff. And yes, we convert more efficiently during pregnancy and lactation, but our levels are still low, and we don't know what's ideal, to be honest. We don't. But it still makes sense to me to say, 300 milligrams a day of DHA and EPA with at least 200 milligrams of DHA during pregnancy. And I would say that, if you look at fish eaters, people that are getting, twice a week fish intake, their levels do tend to be higher. And we can achieve that very same thing by getting our DHA and EPA from the same source the fish get it. And the fish get EPA and DHA from mainly microalgae in the ocean, which are little tiny plants in the ocean. And we're now culturing and producing this stuff without having to rape the ocean of fish, without having to kill millions and millions of fish. And the bonus is that the microalgae-based EPA DHA is not contaminated with heavy metals or environmental contaminants the way, of course, fish are. And so should other people take it as well? I just don't see a big downside to doing that. I don't take it every day myself, but I probably take it 2 or 3 times a week. And I think a reasonable amount is 200 or 300 milligrams. So that's that.
A recent study claimed vegans have more bone fractures. Is this true?
Yes, it's true, and it is concerning, but it's not, to me, terribly surprising. The study was Epic Oxford. It involved about 55,000 individuals, and it compared the risk of bone fracture in vegans with, pesco-vegetarians and semi-vegetarians and lacto-ovo-vegetarians and omnivores. And vegans actually had a 43% higher risk of overall fractures and double the risk of hip fractures. And to put this into some perspective, it means about 20 more fractures per 1,000 individuals over a 10-year time period. And some vegans say, oh, it was a bad study and don't pay any attention to it, but it was not a bad study. It was a decent study, and it was the same population, Epic Oxford, that showed us that vegans and vegetarians have lower rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, diverticular disease, kidney stones, cataracts, all those good things. And so, we do need to pay attention to this study. So why did the vegans in this study have higher rates of fractures, and what can we do to prevent them? I mean, we need to look at those things. There are a lot of possible explanations for why vegans had a higher fracture risk. But I think probably one of the most important is they have a lower BMI. They tend to, have healthier body weights. It means that, I think generally it means when you have a lower body weight, you have less bone mass and bone density as a rule. And so when you carry more fat, it means you have more cushioning against falls. It means you have more estrogen, which increases bone density. You have a heavier load on your skeleton, which, we all always talk about bone bearing or weight bearing activities for bones. And what's really interesting though is people who were vegan that had a body mass index over 22.5 did not have a higher risk, but nearly a quarter of the vegans had a BMI below 20, compared to about 8% for the omnivores. So more vegans have super low BMIs below 20, which will increase the risk. They also had lower calcium intake, so they averaged just over 590 milligrams, whereas the omnivores averaged over 1,000, just over 1,000 milligrams. Lower calcium, maybe not such a good thing. They didn't look at vitamin D intakes in this study, but they've looked at the vitamin intakes of this population in previous studies, and they're quite low, much lower than the omnivores. So that may have played a role. They have lower B12 intakes. And again, it wasn't listed in this study, but the same population has been assessed in terms of B12 intakes in previous studies, and they have much lower status. This is a UK population, and they don't do as well as the North American population in terms of calcium intake, and in terms of vitamin D, in terms of vitamin B12. So there may be a significant difference there. Now, there are 2 other things that I think were kind of interesting in this study. And one is that the vegans actually were more physically active. So then we have to say, well, I wonder if they had more sport fractures than the omnivores because of that physical activity. But they also took far less HRT, or hormone replacement therapy. So it was over 25% in the omnivores, and it was around 5 or 6% in the vegans. So, and of course, hormone replacement therapy increases bone density. So that may have factored in as well. there are a lot of things we can do and we should do to ensure as vegans that we build and maintain strong bones. We want to maintain a healthy body weight and not be underweight, because underweight is a risk factor for osteoporosis. We want to meet the RDA for calcium. So as adults, we're aiming for 1,000 milligrams a day. If you're a woman over 50 or a man over 70, you're aiming for 1,200. So that's a lot of calcium, and it's lower. The recommended intakes are actually lower in the UK than they are in North America, and we don't know which is really ideal. But it's not that difficult to get to those RDAs if you're using some fortified non-dairy milks. You want to make sure you get enough vitamin D. We just talked about vitamin D, super important. Now, this is one, we used to always say that protein increased urinary calcium excretion, so could contribute to bone loss. Now we say the opposite. You need to get enough protein to maintain strong bones, because protein is part of the bone matrix. And although it does increase urinary calcium losses, it also increases bone building activities, and it increases absorption of calcium. So, get enough protein. We need to ensure enough B12. We want to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, because that helps us to retain a more alkaline system, which helps to reduce urinary calcium losses. We want to avoid excessive alcohol. And maybe most important of all, we want to keep telling our bones to stay strong by doing weight-bearing exercises. And so that, to me, is critical. You want to be doing an hour of exercise every day, ideally. That's optimal. So there are lots of things we can do. And even though we're seeing studies that are showing higher rates of fractures in vegetarians and vegans, or vegans particularly, we can avoid that, and we need to take those steps to avoid that.
What impact does diet have on the planet and climate change?
Well, it's, I just actually did a lecture on what's going on in the Marshall Islands with climate change. And what we know is that we know animal agriculture is either a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, or is the biggest contributor. Some claim it's one of two, fossil fuels and animal agriculture, and some claim it's even more than fossil fuels. Whichever way you look at it, it is a huge contributor. And what we know is that the foods that contribute the greatest amounts to greenhouse gas emissions are animal products, number one being beef, followed by other meat, and eggs and dairy are, sort of somewhere in the middle. And then plant foods are way lower down, with the except there are a few exceptions, like palm oil is fairly high up, cocoa is fairly high up. But in general, plant foods like beans and vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds are all very, very low in terms of greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. And in fact, there was a study done, published in the proceedings, the National Academy proceedings, or National Academy of Science proceedings. Anyway, this was back in 2016, I think. And they were looking at how much greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 2050 if the entire planet followed the World Health Organization guidelines for healthy eating, reduced meat intake, reduced calorie intakes, ate more plant foods, and they estimated it to be close to 30%, 29% to be exact. They also estimated the reduction if everyone went vegan, and they estimated that at about 70%. So that kind of tells the story. We need to, as a global population, shift towards a plant-based diet if we're going to save the planet. I think that just going plant-based may not be enough to save the planet, but I don't think we have any chance of saving the planet if we don't go plant-based. And that's one of the reasons that I get so upset when I see the promotion of keto and paleo and low carb and all of that saying, eat more meat, eat more meat, eat more meat. It's just, to me, it's unconscionable that we would be promoting more meat when we face this global situation of climate change. And when you think about the number of animals, I mean, I just think about the 70 billion animals a year that are slaughtered so we can eat them, and the conditions in which those animals are raised and in the conditions in which those animals die. I don't understand how anybody can justify this position of eating more animal products. Anyway, all that having been said, we need to shift. We just need to shift, period. And even if a person just cuts back 50% on the meat they're consuming, that will be a significant reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions. But the further you can get towards a completely plant-based diet, the lower your contribution will be in terms of your carbon footprint. I can remember my son telling me, he phoned me right after this environmental sciences class in fourth year university. And he said, "Mom, you're not going to believe it. Everybody in the class had to calculate their carbon footprint today." And my son lived about a half an hour from school and had to drive to school every day. And a lot of his friends rode bikes and took like 2-minute showers and, did all of these wonderful things. And he had by far the lowest carbon footprint in the class. And the kids were the other students were just like, "No way, how can that be? He drives his car to school every day." And the teacher said, "Read my lips. He doesn't eat meat. You'll never touch him as long as you eat meat." And that's the reality.
How do you prevent type 2 diabetes, and can it be reversed?
So type 2 diabetes is something that is near and dear to my heart for sure. And I will start sounding like a broken record as I talk about this, but I actually recently wrote 2 books and I'm going to show them to you. One is called Kick Diabetes Essentials and one is called the Kick Diabetes Cookbook. And these books cover this topic in significant detail. So first of all, yes, type 2 diabetes can be reversed. And in fact, in 2009, we had a consensus statement from the American Diabetes Association, actually defining what diabetes remission looks like. And it's basically, you have normal blood glucose, normal A1C, no diabetes medications or other interventions for at least a year. And there are all sorts of different definitions of diabetes remission. We started seeing diabetes remission with bariatric surgery. That was interesting. And then there was a group in the UK, Roy Taylor's group, that actually said, well, gee, if you could get diabetes remission using these bariatric surgery and you're just eliminating, or reducing food so dramatically, I wonder if we could get it just on a really low calorie diet. So they started doing a whole bunch of studies using, these formulas with, feeding people like 800 calories a day and all sorts of different things. And in fact, they had tremendous success with diabetes remission in these individuals. And they found that for those that lost at least 15 kilos or, 35 or so pounds, they had an over, I think it was over 80% reversal or remission rate. And the less you lost, the lower your remission. And the other thing that affected remission was how long people have had diabetes. So if you've had diabetes, if you're fairly recently diagnosed, your chances of reversing it or going into remission are much higher than someone who has had diabetes and done a lot more damage to their pancreas. But what's really interesting is that when you have fat in your pancreas, and this is called lipotoxicity. So when you store fat in your liver, it actually drives insulin resistance. And your liver can actually put out fat that goes to your muscle tissue and other vital organs like your pancreas. And the pancreas has absolutely no tolerance for storing fat. So when you store fat in your pancreas, it actually puts beta cells to sleep. And by going on a diet and using up these fat stores, these that especially in your liver and pancreas, it reverses insulin resistance, and it can actually wake up beta cells, which is just amazing. So this is something of great interest to me. But how do you prevent diabetes? Well, number one, you maintain, a healthy body weight. You exercise every day, and so this is something that is a challenge for a lot of people, especially in North America, where 70% of the population is either overweight or obese. So how do you do this? Well, you want to be eating a nutrient dense, which means a lot of nutrients per calorie, high fiber, whole food, plant-based diet featuring a lot of leafy greens, colorful veggies, legumes, intact whole grains, fruits, nuts, seeds. Those should be the foundation of the diet. You want to absolutely minimize processed foods, especially highly processed foods that have added sugar and fat and salt and all of those things. You want to minimize animal products, and you want to completely avoid processed meat and red meat because they've been associated with increased risk. You want to get your macronutrients from high fiber whole plant foods. So carbohydrates from whole plant foods, not from refined sources. You want to get your protein from plants rather than animal products. You want to get your fat from whole plant foods rather than concentrated fats and oils or meat. You want to minimize added fats because they contain a lot of calories in a small space. So 1 tablespoon of oil, for example, has 120 calories. And it's just this tiny little thing. You add it to your pasta or your salad, you don't even feel like you're eating anymore, but you're getting a whole lot more calories. And there's almost no nutrients in oil. So you're wanting to get those fats from the whole foods as opposed to the added fats. You want to minimize products of oxidation from cooking. So you want to use more moist cooking methods as opposed to dry cooking methods. You want to avoid blackening of foods. You want to avoid frying of foods because you get a lot of products of oxidation when you do that. You want to minimize environmental contaminants, which means eating lower on the food chain, eating organic foods when you can. You want to ensure a source of omega-3 fatty acids, so flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, walnuts, and possibly using some EPA DHA because people who have insulin resistance don't tend to convert the plant fats to the long chain fats quite as efficiently. You want to avoid artificial sweeteners. And a lot of people say, artificial sweeteners are so appreciated by people who have diabetes or who are combating diabetes because it allows you to have sweet foods without having the calories. But what it does is it messes with your palate and it makes you want more sweets. But the other thing that it does is it can actually compromise your gut microbiota, and it can cause dysbiosis. And this is not something you want because when you have dysbiosis, it causes inflammation. And so you just want to avoid artificial sweeteners completely. You want to use plenty of antioxidant-rich herbs and spices. You want water to be your beverage of choice, and you want your diet to be nutritionally adequate. You want enough magnesium and chromium, and so that means consuming a wide variety of foods. And possibly, if you're, really limiting calories, you're having 12 or 1,400 calories a day to try to lose weight, you might want to take a high quality multivitamin mineral supplement.
What about eggs? Are they healthy? What about egg whites?
Well, eggs, the research is a little bit all over the place with eggs. Some suggest higher rates of disease and mortality with egg consumption, and others finding, not a huge impact with egg consumption. And I think probably the most important study to me was a study out of Harvard that had over 130,000 participants followed for about 30 years. So this is, a really important study. What they found is they looked at what happened with the individuals in that study if 3% of calories from protein from animal foods was replaced with protein from plants. And to put that into perspective, it's about 60 calories in a 2,000 calorie diet. So 60 calories from eggs would be like one small or medium-sized egg. A large egg has about 80 calories. So what they found was replacing one small or medium egg with about the same amount of calories from plant protein would actually reduce your risk of death by 19%. That is pretty powerful stuff. The figure was about 34% for processed meat and about 12% for unprocessed meat. So eggs were somewhere between processed meat and unprocessed meat. And in addition, eggs are super concentrated in cholesterol. And cholesterol has been associated with a higher risk of liver disease. It's also been, eggs have also been associated with increased risk of prostate cancer. Some studies have shown a very small increased risk of diabetes with egg consumption as well. And now that's with, moderate egg consumption. There was actually a study out of the US that I thought was interesting. They actually reported a 58% higher diabetes risk in men consuming 7 or more eggs a week, and a 77% increased risk in women consuming 7 or more eggs a week. So that's a huge increase. And then there was another Korean research team that reported an almost 3 times increased risk of cardiovascular disease in those eating the most versus the fewest eggs. So we still are seeing studies that would give us cause for concern. And of course, one of the things that I have to say about eggs is these are, you think about chickens and the egg production, and it is not a pretty picture, I can tell you. Just do a search about how we're producing the number of eggs we're producing in the United States, for example. All of the eggs that are, all of the chicks that are produced to be egg producers, if they're males, they're just slaughtered, and not in very pretty ways, I might add. And so that's just millions and millions of chicks. Just the numbers are extraordinary. And we keep these animals in, these confined conditions where they can't even expand their wings, or they can't even move. It's just awful conditions, so that we can consume these products that probably don't help us much and may in fact hurt us. So I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to include eggs in the diet.
How can a woman prevent breast cancer?
Well, I think the strongest association between breast cancer and diet is actually for alcohol. There is absolutely no safe level of alcohol intake where breast cancer is concerned. Any amount will increase risk. The second most or strongest association with breast cancer is being overweight. So physical activity and breastfeeding also reduce risk of breast cancer. More food-specific associations suggest that vegetables, fruits, and carotenoid-rich foods are protective, and that soy foods may also be protective, especially if they're consumed during childhood and adolescence. Calcium intake does appear protective as well. We know that glycemic load, so a diet that's got a lot of refined carbohydrates, may increase risk, whereas dietary fiber reduces risk. Red meat increases risk, probably due to the heme iron and saturated fat content. Dairy products, it's kind of interesting because we've seen both sides where dairy products may reduce risk, and some studies where dairy products may increase risk. But there was one study that I thought was super interesting from 2020. This is a brand new study that found increased risk with dairy milk and decreased risk with soy milk. So that would be an easy swap for people to make. Generally, to me, the best route to avoid breast cancer is the same as what we've been talking about all along: nutrient dense, high fiber, whole food, plant-based diet that is nutritionally adequate and has enough calcium.
Is there a way to stop cancer from spreading if you have it and stop it from coming back for people in remission?
We don't really have a lot of studies on this. We certainly can take steps to reduce oxidative stress, inflammation, dysbiosis, overweight, and obesity. And I think that's probably, the best we can do. It's the same song and dance that I've been doing all along: more fruits and vegetables, legumes, intact grains, nuts and seeds, less saturated fat, no alcohol, very limited processed foods, if any. We know that soy has actually been shown to reduce recurrence of breast cancer in people that have had breast cancer or have breast cancer. But we just don't have a lot of other studies on that.
What's wrong with eating fish? A lot of people say it's healthy.
Fish has been hailed to be a very healthy food by most health authorities for a lot of years. It's thought to be heart healthy. It's thought to reduce risk of disease, including cognitive decline. And I think the reason is fish is our primary source of omega-3 fatty acids, the long chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. It's lower in saturated fat than red meat or poultry. So it's often recommended as a replacement. And when it replaces meat or poultry, it tends to improve health. But it seems to me that replacing, meat with fish is a good call from a health perspective. Probably replacing meat with legumes is even better. So, because, and I say that because of a few things. Despite the potential benefits of fish, there are significant causes of, causes for concern with fish intake. Fish is probably our most concentrated source of a number of environmental contaminants. Persistent organic pollutants like PCBs, DDTs, dioxin, but also heavy metals, especially mercury, of course, in large predatory fish. Fish is actually one of the few direct sources of TMAO, which is, often formed when you eat red meat, but you can get TMAO directly from eating fish. And TMAO is a very atherogenic compound. It increases the risk of heart disease. And eating fish, to me, is just, sort of ethically and ecologically questionable, to say the least. So, the estimates are by 2050, our fish stocks will be virtually depleted. So I think that we can figure out how to get the nutrients that fish supplies, the EPA and DHA, in a more healthful way by getting our EPA and DHA from the same sources that fish do, from microalgae, by eating plant sources of omega-3s that can be converted into these long chain omega-3s, like flax and chia and hemp and walnuts. So I would say those are better choices.
What is a food desert, and what can we do about people who live near them?
Food deserts are basically regions where people have very limited access to healthy food. And this may be for a number of reasons. They may live in the inner city where there aren't a lot of grocery stores or vegetable markets. There are a lot of convenience stores. And so they just don't have access to healthy options. They may not have cars. There may be people living out in the country that that don't have access, either. So it's really food deserts are places where access to healthy food is just very limited. And so what happens to people in food deserts is they tend to eat a lot of processed foods because I think of the Marshall Islands, for example, where I did a lot of the diabetes research. They live so far from anything and they have so little land area that they have to import foods. Well, the cheapest foods to import are foods that have a lot of shelf life. And so that's what gets imported. They have a lot of rice and spam and canned meats and ramen noodles and that is essentially a food desert. And so what happens with people eating a lot of highly processed foods is they have a lot of lifestyle diet-induced diseases. And so how can we help people in food deserts. And there are a lot of people that have come up with very effective solutions. And one of the things we did in the Marshall Islands was to teach people to grow foods, even just in earth boxes, but any way of growing foods, supporting community agriculture, whether it's a backyard garden or a community garden, can be really helpful. There are a lot of volunteer efforts going on now that I think are just amazing. The people that are organizing these efforts are sort of food desert heroes in my view. But what they're doing is they collect waste from farms and farmers markets and bring them to these food deserts so that people have access to either very inexpensive or free produce. Some people have actually developed programs to teach small store owners how to buy, store, and sell fresh produce. There have been all sorts of initiatives launched to create affordable produce markets, and or bringing, in like veggie vans, I guess you'd call them, vans of produce, so that people would have inexpensive access to these wonderful foods. And then we even see some folks starting nonprofit grocery stores, co-ops, buying clubs. All of these are very reasonable solutions in my view.
How are all animals treated that are raised for food, and why is this accepted as normal?
I wouldn't say all, but I would say 90% of animals are raised in what we call concentrated animal feeding operations. And concentrated animal feeding operations are not the same for all animals, but if you take pigs for an example, they're sort of warehoused in these buildings where the pigs have these little stalls that are so small that they can't really lie down or turn around. And they're kept, pigs are considered to be a little more intelligent than dogs, somewhere around a 3 to 5 year old child. And dogs are rated at about a 2.5-year-old child, I think, on average. But these animals would live about 12 to 15 years, sort of a similar sort of lifespan as what a dog would have. And they are at a very early age, their tails are docked, their ears are docked, their genitals are cut off, because they literally are trying to keep them from going insane when they're confined in these conditions and, biting one another's tails, because there'd be a pig right in front and right behind them. These animals have the sensitivity of smelling that's probably about 200 times stronger than a human. And the stench in these factories is so powerful that we need gas masks to go in. And it's the dust and dander and everything else is just beyond belief in these places. And these animals that would live 12 to 15 years are killed after about 6 months. They're just stuffed with food, kept in place, stuffed with food, and then slaughtered so we can enjoy our piece of bacon or ham that in turn ends up killing us. It is absolute insanity. When you think about how precious our pets are to us, our dogs are to us, these animals are every bit as sentient, if not more, than our dogs. And yet we do this to them, and we somehow justify doing it because we think it's necessary, we think it tastes good, whatever our excuses. We're destroying the planet in the process, and we're destroying our health in the process. There is no excuse for what we're doing. If we were some other alien, civilization looking down at what human beings are doing to the animals we call food, we would be absolutely shocked. And we somehow disassociate ourselves from the goings on to get meat, camouflaged in cellophane into our grocery stores. I just can't help but thinking that someday the human species will get to a point in our progression that we will understand that this is wrong. It's morally corrupt. It's wrong. And hopefully we will say no more. We don't need it. It's hurting us. It's hurting our planet, and it's hurting these animals. And it's just time that it stopped.
Should we try to avoid or add salt in our diet? How big a problem is salt? What health problems does it cause? And why do some people say we need salt?
Well, I wouldn't say we need to completely avoid salt, but I would say we need to moderate our intake. And most North Americans consume on average 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day. Men average more than 4,000 milligrams, and so women it's a little less. But what we want is probably somewhere between 12 and 2,300 milligrams a day. I would say for most adults who in North America are overweight, at risk for chronic disease, 1,500 milligrams is a really sensible target. We have something, we don't have an upper limit for sodium, but we have something called the chronic disease risk reduction for sodium, and that is 2,300 milligrams a day for adults. And what the chronic disease risk reduction means is that if you consume more than 2,300 milligrams, you should reduce your intake for health. And so that's what's generally recommended. Some people say we need salt because we do. We need sodium. Sodium is an essential nutrient, but it is present in natural foods. We get, chomping on a piece of celery, we would get sodium. So it's, the problem is most people just eat too much of it, and it's added to processed food. And so probably 75 to 80% of the sodium most people eat comes from processed food. So if you just did one thing and eliminate sodium in processed foods, your intake would be very moderate, and you wouldn't have to worry about adding a tiny bit of salt when you're cooking food. So that, I think that's the best thing people can do, is just to get rid of that. Now, according to the biggest problem with sodium is it increases blood pressure, and blood pressure increases risk of heart disease and all sorts of other diseases as well. According to the Center for Disease Control, about 60% of Americans 60 years of age and older have hypertension, and about a third of those people ages 40 to 59 years of age. So it is a huge problem. And so it's easy. Most people eating plant-based, whole food plant-based diets are right in the ballpark of where they need to be with sodium, because they're not eating processed foods. And that's just as simple as that.
Which nutritional supplements do you recommend everyone take?
Well, nutritional supplements are not necessarily needed by everyone, but for those who eat predominantly or exclusively plant-based diet, I would recommend vitamin B12, 1,000 micrograms twice a week, or 100 micrograms a day. I know Michael Greger says 50 micrograms a day, and that may be sufficient, but I did some calculations based on absorption rates, and I felt more comfortable with 100 micrograms, especially during pregnancy and lactation and more vulnerable times of life. Seniors, actually, I would recommend 1,000 micrograms daily. So once you hit 65, I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. Vitamin D, somewhere 1,000 to 3,000 IUs per day, unless you have really good status and year-round sun exposure. Iodine, if you're not using iodized salt and you're not eating seaweed, I would recommend 150 micrograms a day. And it's more, it's 220 for pregnancy, 290 for lactation. So it'd be higher for those individuals. I would suggest 200 to 300 milligrams of EPA DHA every day or every other day, or even twice a week, although I know it's still controversial, but I would suggest that. And then a prenatal supplement for people who are pregnant that includes iron, choline, and iodine. And then other supplements, just as indicated by your physician. So if you're, if there's a concern about your iron status, you may need to take iron and so forth.
How do you protect your thyroid?
Well, for most people, the concern regarding thyroid health is about a condition called hypothyroid disease, which means you are not producing enough thyroid hormone or hormones. And so the thyroid hormones are really important, helping to control your metabolism, your growth and repair of cells. When you have hypothyroidism, you feel cold, you feel tired, you gain weight very easily, your blood cholesterol levels go up. And there are some nutrients that I think you just need to be conscious of for optimal thyroid function. And the first of those is iodine. So iodine, why is iodine so important? It's so important because you need it to make thyroid hormones. So shortages can cause hypothyroidism because you're not producing as many thyroid hormones. And probably about a third of the global population doesn't get enough iodine. It's less common, iodine deficiency when salt is iodized or seaweed is regularly consumed. Vegans can be at increased risk because the main dietary sources of iodine, other than seaweed, are fish, dairy, and dairy products and eggs. And dairy products are rich in iodine just because we clean teats and all of the milking machinery with iodine, and so it gets into the milk. So it's no, special thing about dairy. It's just that's how it's used. And so if you're relying on iodine, you need to be really careful because it's actually easy to get too much iodine with seaweed. And the best example is kelp powder. You get 150 micrograms, which is, sort of the RDA with 1/16 of a teaspoon or thereabouts. So you can imagine if you're consuming a teaspoon, you're way over the upper limit of 1,100 micrograms. So you need to be careful of that because too much can interfere with thyroid function as well. And then there are two other nutrients that I think are worth mentioning where thyroid health is concerned. And one is selenium. Selenium actually I'll mention both of this because they do the same thing. Selenium and zinc actually both help to activate thyroid hormones. So they're important to thyroid function. And selenium, the best sources are Brazil nuts, other nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains, but Brazil nuts are by far the most concentrated source. Some fish and eggs are also sources. So, omnivores would rely on those, or maybe lacto-vegetarians or pesco-vegetarians. But a single Brazil nut can supply the daily needs of 55. It's 55 micrograms a day that are recommended. So it's not very difficult to get if you do include a Brazil nut or two in your diet. And then zinc, legumes, nuts, seeds are the most concentrated sources. And then otherwise, you just want to eat a varied, healthy diet. If you have a thyroid disease and you wonder about soy and goitrogens and all of that, you may need to moderate your intake of soy and other goitrogens. And goitrogens are, cruciferous vegetables are goitrogens. And generally, if you have enough iodine in your diet, you don't have to worry about goitrogens. But people that actually have thyroid, hypothyroid disease may want to moderate their intakes a little bit. If you have Hashimoto's, there is some evidence to suggest eliminating gluten could be helpful for you. So that is something you could experiment with. And a lot of people think that vegans would have higher levels of thyroid disease because they eat more goitrogens. Goitrogens are in plant foods like soy and cruciferous vegetables and peaches and strawberries and millet and flax seeds and all sorts of foods. But in fact, there was an interesting study from the Seventh-day Adventist Health Study that actually reported that vegan diets reduced hypothyroid disease by about 22%. So we see lower levels of thyroid disease in vegans. So that I thought was really interesting.
Do you recommend eating the new vegan burgers that are made from a variety of pea and similar proteins?
I wouldn't say I actually recommend eating them. but I would recommend eating them over meat, certainly. And I am cheering on the people that are producing them. I think they have the potential to remove or to move people away from eating meat. And that, in my mind, is worth celebrating. The more similar they taste to meat, the more acceptance there will be for their consumption by omnivores. So from an environmental perspective, they use about 99% less water, 93% land, 90% less, and produce about 90% less greenhouse gas emissions. So that in of itself is a major environmental win. So I think, they don't contribute to pain, suffering, and death of animals. That's a major animal rights win. Many people believe they offer no advantage over beef burgers in terms of health. I disagree. I think they do. They provide similar amounts of protein and fat, but they have slightly less saturated fat and they have no cholesterol. They contain fiber, they contain no trans fats, whereas beef burgers do. They are higher in iron, they're higher in calcium. They don't contain any new 5-GC or carnitine that gets converted to TMAO. They don't contain the endotoxins that regular meat burgers would contain. They contain fewer environmental contaminants, fewer heterocyclic amines, because they don't produce heterocyclic amines when they're cooked. They don't, so they do have nutritional advantages without any question. And of course, beans and lentils are a better choice than these, burgers. However, again, they have a place, and I think it's okay that they're in the market. I think it's okay when you have, relatives who are meat-eating relatives over to make some, Beyond or Impossible burgers to serve them, or the sausages or whatever. I wouldn't make them a regular feature in the diet, but I think occasional use is really fine.
What is the scientifically proven most effective way to lose weight and keep it off?
You know what? There are a lot of diets that have proven effective in weight loss. You can lose weight in a lot of ways. I can remember I can't remember. I can remember seeing ads from back in the 1920s. I wasn't born until the 50s. So from back in the 1920s, where they were encouraging people to smoke cigarettes to lose weight. And smoking cigarettes is actually a fairly effective way to keep weight off or to lose weight. It doesn't make it a good idea. It'll kill you. So to me, the bigger question is, what is the most healthful way to effectively lose weight? And the answer is simply a diet that will keep you the healthiest for the longest period of time. And there are so many reasonable steps that people can take to achieve and maintain a healthy weight for life. Number one, eating a nutrient-dense, high-fiber, whole food, plant-based diet. Number two, eating a diet that's less calorically dense. So you can still enjoy eating lots of food without eating excess calories. So, like a tablespoon of fat has 120 calories. Well, you could eat 10 or 15 cups of greens for that number of calories and feel like you're actually eating something. You want to up your intake of non-starchy vegetables and fruits. I would say 9 or 10 servings a day at a minimum, including whole beans and legumes, at least 1 serving a day. Just boosts your fiber intake so much, helps to keep you full for longer with very little fat. The other thing that I think people can do is to keep their grains intact. And this means basically not eating foods that are made with even whole grains that are processed. So you're removing all the flour products, the muffins and cookies and cakes and breads and all of those things. If you only eat grains intact, you're eating kamut berries and quinoa and oat groats and unhulled barley. These grains are not so much associated with weight gain as the grains that are processed. You want to completely avoid refined grains and any added sugars. You want to go lightly on concentrated calories. So nuts and seeds and avocados, you want to choose, maybe an ounce a day and not too much more. And then you even want to keep portion sizes of other concentrated calories like grains and starchy vegetables moderate. So you don't want to be consuming huge portion sizes. You want to not overeat. You want to learn to listen to your body in terms of its hunger cues and its satiety cues as well. So you're not eating when you're not hungry. I would suggest not eating between meals at all. And I would also suggest that people stop eating after supper. I think it's ideal if you have about 12 to 15 hours between supper and breakfast. So if you eat your dinner at 6 o'clock at night, you eat your breakfast at 8 o'clock the next morning. That's awesome. You've got 14 hours between those meals, and it gives you kind of that period of, sort of time restricted feeding. It's like a modified fast, if you will. The other thing that's really important is don't drink your calories, because when you drink your calories, it doesn't register with your appetite control center the way eating solid foods does. I think having a smoothie to replace your breakfast meal is okay if that keeps you full till lunch. But if it doesn't, then you want to be eating those foods instead of blending them in a smoothie. And then you want to be drinking water as your primary beverage of choice. 0 calories, a very, very good choice. And then there's one thing that I'm going to say that I know is a little bit more controversial, but I would say if you are not averse to this idea, weigh yourself every day. And the reason I say that is that the science essentially supports that people that weigh themselves every day are better able to maintain a healthy weight over time. And when you weigh yourself every day and you gain a pound, that day that you've gained your pound, if you weigh in the morning, you just seem to have a little more diligence around overeating. You just are trying to cut back naturally. And I know of several people who have, like I think of my mom and one of my dearest friends who have maintained their weight, and myself for that matter, over time. So my mom was, I think, 126 pounds when she got married about 60 years ago. Actually, it was more than 60 years ago. She still weighs between 126 and 130 pounds. And she's weighed herself every day her entire life, and she just cuts back. And I do too. I find if I gain a little bit of weight, it's just really simple for me. I don't have treats that day. I don't have the extra little treat that I've made. I have my meal, and for dessert, maybe I have an orange or something like that. And that seems to do the trick. So I think it's a good idea to do that. And then finally, I would say, don't forget the exercise piece. I think it's really important to include exercise in any good program for weight loss or weight maintenance.
Why was it important for you to come speak here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, I would say the main reasons are the Real Truth About Health conference is the one conference that I can think of that is offered to the public free of charge. It's accessible to people all around the world, and it's accessible on platforms that people have access to. So the reach is just incredible. It's a wonderful opportunity to educate people on a very broad scale. And for me, I love the idea that people who don't have access or are not able or cannot afford to travel to a conference have access to something like this free of charge. So I'm so grateful for that.
And we are grateful for you. You've been with us every year, and we appreciate it, as does our audience, very much. So thank you for all your great work. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for all of your time, Brenda. Great to see you again.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Take care.
Be well.
You too.